You know, I know what you want. You want me to cut to someone with a tremendously bad take that I can poke fun at, who has said things deserving of mockery. Please direct me towards today's object of ridicule. It seems that this is a community that enjoys seeing the failings of others debunked, like some kind of very boring sadists. Not only are we all bad people who enjoy seeing other people fail, we're also really not very fun at parties. Hey, do you want to know why Screen Rant is wrong about Avengers Endgame? That's not even a bad party line, that's literally the question I'm about to ask you, because that's what today's video is about. Doesn't that sound really exciting? The answer to that is no, it doesn't, but you're gonna stick around for the whole thing, because like me, you're a fucking nerd. Let's go. Today's sacrifice is this Screen Rant article that one of you lovely people sent me. I felt like it was about time that I covered Screen Rant, because I've made fun of them enough in the past for things like not knowing what the word hidden means, but I've never taken a closer look at their contributions to the industry, which I feel is something that's long overdue. In a nutshell, the intro to the article goes like this.
Endgame is good, but it's not perfect. So today we're going to be pointing out some of the logical flaws in Avengers Endgame.
This should be right up my alley because I'm one of those people who has that thing that means that they really enjoy movie nitpicks. What's that called again?
Pull interpersonal skills.
Thanks. At least I like movie nitpicks when they're done well. Their first nitpick is that it doesn't make sense that Thanos told Nebula his retirement plans. Screen Rant's take is that Thanos, a character who's been characterized as the kind of person to tell complete strangers, a TLDR of his life story, wouldn't be the kind of person to tell one of his own daughters his retirement plans, because, well, let's have a look at the reasons they give, shall we? The first paragraph is basically, Gamora is Thanos' favourite daughter, and Nebula got a bit neglected. And then, from that, they extrapolate that Thanos would never tell Nebula anything. That's not how inferences work. Other than using her as a pawn, Thanos never really included poor Nebula. Thanos would never bother to tell Nebula anything that important to him. She might want to try and join him or something. Are you serious? Let's just humour the idea that he would never tell Nebula this for a few seconds, despite the fact that he's been clearly shown to be a character who loves droning on about all of the things he plans to do, to say that, okay, maybe he's not telling Nebula. Let's say he's telling Gamora. Do you really think he'd ask Nebula to leave the room so that she doesn't find out? Or are you starting to realise that that would be totally out of character for him? But speaking of things that are out of character, in the movie Nebula says that she asked him where he'd go when his plan was complete. It's explicitly stated that he didn't even volunteer the information, he was asked for it. Do you really think he'd just point blank refuse to answer that question? No, Thanos loves talking about shit that he's planning. Ooh. What the fuck? He had been seen to turn Nebula the cold shoulder a couple of times, but you can't really extrapolate that to mean that he would never tell her anything like you guys have done. There's certainly no contradiction of character here. On top of that, they also say this in their article. At the beginning of Endgame, the undusted heroes are hunting down Thanos. They want the Infinity Gauntlet to change everything back. Nebula becomes pivotal here because she knows the farming planet he always dreamed of retiring on. Wah wah. She does know what Thanos' retirement plan is, but she's in no way pivotal to them finding out where he is. It's actually Rocket locating a power surge caused by a second snap of the Infinity Gauntlet that lets them figure out where he is. So, maybe try watching the film. You know, I must congratulate Screen Rant for their efficiency here. We're only one item into their list, and they've already managed to thoroughly demonstrate that they have no idea what it is they're talking about. But so far, they have got 0 out of 25 correct. I'm going to be keeping score, by the way. I couldn't find anywhere to properly organically mention that I was going to be doing that, so I'm going to be doing that. But we can't be too quick to judge them. Let's see what they say next to see if it gets any better. The 24th item on their list is that it doesn't make any sense that Thor would let himself go. I'm going to stop you right there. It does. Him spiraling into a depression following a disaster he could easily have prevented by going for the head is within his character. But their complaint is that the arc isn't delivered very effectively, that it's played too often for laughs. That's not something that doesn't make sense though, that's just something that you don't really like. I don't like it either. So, I mean, this doesn't fit your title, but it's true, so I'll give you half a point for this one. Number 23 on their list is Captain Marvel left us underwhelmed. You can say that again, have you seen that film? Do you get it? I was pretending to think that they were talking about the movie instead of the character in Endgame as a joke where I could imply that the film was underwhelming. It's very funny, I'm very clever. At the end of Avengers Infinity War, Nick Fury used a pager to contact Captain Marvel, an incredibly powerful woman who left the planet years ago. The end credit scene framed her as a wildly important component to defeating Thanos, a person who would change the tide. Unfortunately though, that's not quite what happened. After all, the most important thing she did was play taxi for Tony and Nebula to get them back to Earth. Beyond that, she just kind of fades into the background. She's there, but she exists as backup, nothing more. So this is kind of like the last one. It's right, but it doesn't really belong on this list. Like, everything they say in this one is true. She's not that important. She's not that important. Hold up. As far as I recall, she only, saves the man who literally saves everything. Then on top of that, she destroys Thanos' ship, something that no one else, it seems, was even capable of doing. And then on top of that, she prevents Thanos from snapping his fingers. The end credit scene framed her as a wildly important component to defeating Thanos, a person who would change the tide. Unfortunately though, that's not quite what happened. She only managed to be a completely vital component of saving the entire world 3 times. That's a pretty disappointing total, Carol. Try a little harder next time, yeah? Okay, Screen Rant, let me help you out. The nitpick that you're attempting to make here is that she had very little screen time after being set up as a big component. Claiming that she's not a wildly important component to defeating Thanos, or a person who didn't change the tide, is flat out untrue. But you tried, so I'll give you +1 attempt points. What are attempt points worth? Nothing, but they make you feel better. So you're still at 0.5 out of 25. On my completely worthless and not worth anything, that's what worthless means, yes, accuracy rating system that I've made up for this video. Hooray! The 22nd item on their list of nitpicks is Valkyrie's survival. Avengers Infinity War begins with Thanos completely destroying the Asgardian refugee convoy. Without a home, the proud people are decimated and Thor remains the only survivor. Fans assumed that this implied all his kin, including fan favourite Valkyrie, were gone. Well, some fans might have assumed that Thor was the only survivor, but fans who actually paid attention to the film noticed this line.
He stole the space stone from me when he destroyed my ship and slaughtered half of my people, half.
You know, slaughtering half of a people, like that thing that Thanos is known to do? I think that might have something to do with the plot of the film, actually. Still 0.5 out of 25, guys. Things that don't make sense in Avengers Endgame. 21. Old selves meeting new selves. So the explanation of time travel in Endgame is really fucky and pretty inconsistent. So there's plenty to nitpick here. This should be really easy. But things that are very clear in the time travel rules of Endgame is that going into the past cannot affect the future in any way, and it seems to have a lot to do with creating new timelines rather than affecting the current timeline that you exist in. So there's a lot to nitpick, but there is a core premise of time travel there that is sort of solid, but they don't really stick to it for the whole film. So what do they say? They say a lot of things that tackle time travel do it a little bit differently and wouldn't let people interact with their past selves. Endgame, however, does. That's the whole thing. So they start by making it clear that shows like Doctor Who and Star Trek don't allow for characters to meet themselves. Well, Endgame completely disregarded that and had as many old versions of each character meet their new counterpart. Not only did both Captain America and Hulk have future past chats. No, they didn't. Hulk didn't. Watch the film. But Tony and Thor also had conversations with their now passed on parents. At 3 hours, sure, the movie doesn't have much time for scientific explanations, but really? The Department of Temporal Corrections is horrified. So while there's plenty to nitpick in terms of how the movie actually explains its time travel, simply going, they meet themselves from the past, no, doesn't really cut it. Next! Number 20. Scott's Quantum Escape. In this one they say that Ant-Man shouldn't have been able to escape the quantum realm, mentioning how it's established in Ant-Man and the Wasp that if you go into the quantum realm without a way to navigate, you're not getting back out. Without a ship or some sort of planned tether, it's impossible to return from the quantum realm. Now, firstly, I would just like to give Screen Rant props for remembering Ant-Man and the Wasp. That's quite impressive, not many people do. But that's where my praise for them ends, because Scott shouldn't have been able to get out of the quantum realm. And that's something the film acknowledges.
It means you're not coming home.
I did.
No. You accidentally survived. It's a 1,000,000,000 cosmic fluke.
Now, is relying on something incredibly unlikely happening to kickstart the second half of your plot good storytelling? Not particularly, but it makes sense. It's not a hole, it's a contrivance. Winning the lottery isn't nonsensical, it's just unlikely. So the movie does have an explanation for this, and I'm guessing Screen Rant weren't aware of that because if they were, they should probably have mentioned it. If you're gonna nitpick something, then ignoring the film's explanation for that very thing isn't particularly good form, so I'm definitely not giving them a point for this one. Number 19. It doesn't make sense that they had the Dusted back in action so easily. Place your bets now for whether or not this one holds up. The reasoning that the Dusted shouldn't have been back in action so quickly is that 1, maybe they would have got traumatized by turning to dust, and 2, their bodies might be completely out of whack after being magically summoned into existence by the most powerful artifact in the universe. It can bring you back from the dead after you were literally disintegrated, but you're gonna have a killer stomachache for a while afterwards, so be careful not to get involved in any major battles for a while. Now, I don't think this really needs an explanation to make sense. The stones literally control every aspect of reality, so they can probably bring people back without giving them a stomachache. But the movie actually does have dialogue that explains this, even though I would argue it doesn't need it. Spider-Man gives his account of being dusted to Tony Stark. He says, "Do you remember when we were in space and I got all dusty? I must have passed out because I woke up and you were gone, but Doctor Strange was there, right? And he was like, it's been 5 years, come on, they need us." So it's made very clear that from the perspective of the Dusted, after they were brought back, they didn't really even remember what happened to them. So based on that, they're probably not really going to be traumatized. And the idea that their bodies should be out of whack, yeah, you just made that up. There's no reason to think that that should happen, and the fact that it doesn't happen certainly doesn't contradict anything. So yeah, this nitpick gets a big thumbs down from me. We're still at 0.5 out of 25, by the way. Number 18. It doesn't make sense that no other big bads tried to destroy the Earth during the time skip. And the entire 5 years after Thanos' snap, the Avengers don't talk about any other big bads attacking the Earth. While it's made clear that the average crime still happens, look at Clint's Ronan, no one has seen the new weakness of Earth as an opportunity. Considering how many galactic villains are in the Marvel Universe, it's wild to think that no one saw the chance. Hey Galactus, yeah? You know how literally all the planets in the entire universe have suddenly become weaker? Yes. Well, we should attack the Earth specifically. Fuck it, yeah, why not? I don't know anything about these characters, I'm not a comic guy. If I've got something wrong here, please punish me. So I don't really need to explain to you why this one is stupid, but I'm going to briefly anyway. Clearly the idea that 5 years could just pass with no world-ending level event needing to be stopped by the Avengers isn't unreasonable, so they decided to add the extra justification that the Earth is weak right now, so surely someone's going to want to attack it, while forgetting that literally every other planet is in the same boat. There's even a line about that in the film, actually. Captain Marvel says it. 0.5 out of 25. Things that don't make sense in Avengers Endgame. Number 17. Ronan. Let's see why they think this doesn't make sense. Ronan is a dark persona taken on by several different people. Clint Barton held the mantle in his worst hours. However, the Clint that does that isn't quite the same as the ones that fans know in Avengers. The MCU Hawkeye bends some rules, but ultimately is a man who believes in doing the right thing and protecting his family and the world. That's why he joined S.H.I.E.L.D. after all. While losing his family does pull out a darker, angrier side of Clint, the character we've seen thus far is more likely to join up with Black Widow than start on a loner hunt as Ronan. I mean, it was most likely to make him feel some type of way, am I right? You know, I do kind of agree that going on sprees of criminal killing is kind of an extreme reaction to your entire family and also half the world dying, but I'd also suggest that that's quite an extreme situation. There was no precedent for things like this established that's being contradicted or violated. It's not like we had any idea how he was supposed to react to something like this, but you've just decided that the way he did react was wrong, because of reasons. You can do this to anything that there's no precedent for, and it's really hard to actually debunk those arguments because there's no precedent for it. There's no evidence to actually bring up to the contrary. Why has Hawkeye got an orange couch? He seems more like a black couch kind of guy. Go on, try to argue against that without just going, why? It's really hard because there's no evidence you can bring up. But basically, it doesn't contradict anything, so it's not valid as a nitpick. Alrighty dudes, let's move on to the next one. The next nitpick of Avengers Endgame is that it doesn't make sense that Thor would cut off Thanos' head? Why? You know what, I'll set the scene for this one. Following his defeat at the hands of Thanos, Thor was devastated, distraught, depressed. He'd come so close to stopping the Mad Titan. Even with Thanos at the height of his power, Thor had an opportunity to deliver a single blow against him with Stormbreaker, one of the few and only weapons powerful enough to end his life, a weapon he'd almost died for. But anger had got the better of Thor. First he'd lost his mother, then his father, then his homeland, and finally, Thanos had taken away the last thing he had left, his brother. So we come back to this moment. Thor has one blow, one opportunity, one strike, but his anger gets the better of him. He wants to see the look on the face of the Titan as he dies. Thor wants Thanos to know that he's suffering the same fate as his people, as Heimdall, as Loki. He'd wanted the opportunity to gloat. I told you, you'd die for that. But in those few brief moments he'd let Thanos live further, came the snap. For what? Thor's pride? Half the universe had joined the people he was trying to avenge. And it was his fault. If only he'd gone for the head, they'd all still be living. No families broken, no lives ended. But now the universe felt the same pain he did. Despite the fact that it was too late, Thor promised himself that the next time their paths crossed, he would not make the same mistake, and Thanos would die. Instead of letting anyone try to talk to Thanos or use him for information, or let Nebula get a cathartic stab in, Thor chops off the purple alien's head. While it makes sense that Thor would feel guilty for not doing a better job taking down Thanos with his new axe, the reaction's a bit much. Fuck off! Number 15 is about Tony and Pepper. Throughout Tony Stark and Pepper Potts' romance, she's had a complicated relationship with his hero side. While she admires heroes, her boyfriend's addiction to the super lifestyle takes a toll on his health and their relationship. Their most serious fights have always started and ended with Iron Man. However, as they've gotten more serious past Iron Man 3, Pepper's stance on the whole topic has only gotten more and more confusing. She'll consistently ask him to make promises about heroism that she knows he won't keep. Though she does her best to support him in the end, it still doesn't clear up that uncomfortable and toxic side of their relationship. Basically, sometimes Pepper Potts is uncomfortable with Tony risking his life, but knows that he's doing it for good reasons, so is rationally conflicted about that. But in Endgame, they've clearly come to terms with that. There's a scene where they talk about it, they've settled down and are living a relatively normal life. Pepper cares a great deal about Tony's safety, but is also willing to accept that he needs to do what he needs to do. But according to Screen Rant, this doesn't resolve the thing it clearly resolves. Their evidence is that they said so. They're wrong. So let's move on. Number 14. It doesn't make sense that the Ant-Man crew were doing quantum testing during Thanos' invasion. The article title is 25 Things That Make No Sense About Endgame. This one is about the end credit scene of Ant-Man and the Wasp and Infinity War. That's not Endgame, Screen Rant, but you tried. Now, the fact that it's not even about the film that they're supposed to be nitpicking would be enough for me to not give them a point anyway, but this one is highly questionable on top of that, and I think the way in which it's questionable can be best summed up by just quoting it. After all, they didn't know about the impending Thanos plot, but they should have known something was wrong. They would have more likely been helping citizens somewhere, not bantering on a roof. Helping citizens where, Screen Rant? The battle was in Africa. How are they supposed to know that something is wrong? An alien ship was there a while ago, but that left after the fight in New York ended, and they would have had no information on why it was even there. There are no citizens in their entire hemisphere that could need Ant-Man's help because of the Thanos invasion right now. Number 13 is that it doesn't make sense that the older Nebula would destroy the younger Nebula. When I first read this one, I assumed they would have got it wrong, because of a poor understanding of the characters, you know. Like with the one where they said it didn't make sense that Thor would cut off Thanos' head. I assumed that they just didn't understand the characters and would get it wrong as a result, but that's actually not the case. It's very far from the truth, actually. They actually get this one wrong because they don't understand how the time travel works. Their complaint is that when she destroys the younger version of herself, wouldn't that stop the older version of herself from existing as well? No! It's explicitly stated in this movie that you can't change your future by changing the past, and implied that travelling back in time creates an alternate timeline. So no, watch the fucking film, shut up. Number 12 is that Clint's character is confusing. You know what, I'm totally willing to believe that. I 100% believe that you specifically find Clint's character confusing. They say that in the MCU he switches between one of three things: a family man wrapped up in a harder exterior, a perfect sniper soldier who believes in S.H.I.E.L.D., or a very reluctant hero who wouldn't choose this life if he didn't deem it necessary. None of those things contradict each other, Screen Rant. He could be all three at the same time, and he'd be a perfectly consistent character. But let's see what they say further on this. They give two examples of times that he's apparently acting so differently, he's an inconsistent character. The first is that when he confronts Tony in Civil War, he's a tough guy family man. And the second is that in the Avengers, he's S.H.I.E.L.D.'s beloved agent. Those still don't contradict each other. Hey, Hawkeye's inconsistent because sometimes he's an agent for S.H.I.E.L.D., and sometimes he is tough and has a family. Oh no! I'd also like to point out that this has nothing to do with Endgame. Thing number 12 that doesn't make sense in Avengers Endgame. Hawkeye acts a little bit differently in the Avengers to how he acts in Civil War. What? Number 11 is not destroying the gauntlet when the big battle started. They think that when Thanos arrived on Earth, they should have destroyed the Infinity Gauntlet to prevent it from possibly falling into Thanos' hands. So you remember how in this this kind of obscure movie, you might have heard of it, it's called Avengers Endgame. Right at the beginning of that movie, you learn that Thanos destroyed the Infinity Gauntlet, or at least the stones, which are, you know, the important bit, and to do that he had to use the stones themselves to destroy the stones, because they're so powerful. So my question to you, Screen Rant, would be this. If one of the heroes was in a situation where they could snap their fingers to destroy the Infinity Gauntlet, why not just use that snap to instead, I don't know, get rid of all of Thanos' forces? Like they do. Number 10 of things that don't make sense, apparently, is their game plan versus Thanos. One of the most effective assaults on Thanos was in Avengers Infinity War. Actually, if you're going by effectiveness, I'm pretty sure it's either of the ones in Endgame where they killed him, but carry on. One of the most effective assaults on Thanos was in Avengers Infinity War, where the biggest flaw was Peter Quill losing his mind. Though that plan was effective, working as a team to keep the giant man in one place, they don't seem to have nearly as much coordination during their final battle in Endgame. That's right, they were less coordinated in this battle that they weren't expecting than they were in the battle that they had ample time to plan for. What nonsense. Let's keep reading. People are wailing on Thanos one by one, easily failing in bringing him down. I wonder if there are any in-universe reasons why the Avengers may be less focused on Thanos in the second battle. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that in the battle on Titan, all of the Avengers are literally just fighting Thanos, whereas in the final battle, they're not only fighting Thanos, but also, like, his entire army. Maybe that has something to do with it. Number 9 is that all the original Avengers weren't dusted. They say that it feels too convenient that all of the original Avengers just happened to survive. Now there are some cool theories floating about that Tony and Thor survived, because Thanos promised to Doctor Strange and to Loki that he would spare them, but it's not like this isn't a plot contrivance, so they've correctly identified something that is a plot contrivance here. And nowhere in their paragraphs do they say that it doesn't make sense, only that it's a little too convenient. Which is true, so they're technically right, although it doesn't really make sense to include this on a list of things that don't make sense, because plot contrivances aren't nonsensical, they're just contrivances. So for this one I'm perfectly happy to award them another half point. It's true, it just doesn't really belong on the list. Congratulations, Screen Rant, you finally got 1 whole point. The 8th one is actually in the same boat as well. They talk about how it's disappointing that the Hulk's arc was just kind of scrapped. I've actually got a whole video on this topic. Again though, it's not a logic flaw, it's not something that doesn't make sense. It's something that could have been handled a lot better, but it's not a whole. So again, that's another half point. They're on a roll here. Number 7 is a third example of them just not getting how the time travel works. Wow, they're really milking their own ignorance for all it's worth here, aren't they? They claim that with things like characters meeting themselves and Nebula killing the younger version of herself, that they should have caused loads of paradoxes, while completely ignoring the movie's explanation of how time travel actually works in favour of just being ignorant. Let's use the grandfather paradox as an example of a time travel paradox. The grandfather paradox describes a situation where someone goes back in time and kills their own grandfather before their parent was born. If their parent was never born, then they were never born, and if they were never alive, then there's no one to go back and kill their grandfather, so their grandfather is alive. So they're alive, so they go back in time and kill their grandfather, So they're not alike, so yeah, it's a paradox. But the paradox is only created as a result of the past being able to affect the future. In the rules established for Endgame, they create a new timeline and they don't alter the existing one, so no paradoxes are created. They don't need to avoid paradoxes in Endgame, and you should understand this. Even though they managed to fuck up the consistency of their time travel, this much is clear. Number 6 is that it doesn't make sense that Cap would go to spend the rest of his life with Peggy without telling people that's what he was planning. This one is at least an interesting notion. I hadn't really thought about this before. And of all of the items on their list, it's the one I had to spend the longest time thinking about. I also had a couple of discussions about it with people, one of which I'll play now. I'm trying to figure out if Cap would or wouldn't tell people that he was gonna stay with Peggy.
We told Bucky, I think.
How do we know that?
Well, we don't know it for sure. Bucky just knows.
Bucky knows something.
Yeah.
He must have told Bucky, because Bucky seems to be fully at peace with the fact that he's just turned up super old, you know?
Well, that's the thing. I was thinking maybe he didn't even make the decision until after he had gone, and he was like, but do I want to go back? Oh, I could go get that dance while I'm here. Well, do I need to go back? You know.
I think it was something that he
was planned. Yeah.
Do you think that there's going to be, like, they're re-releasing the movie with deleted scenes? Do you think that's going to be, like, one of the deleted scenes?
Not him,
I
like...
don't think so.
The fact that I've heard so little about the re-release, and when I checked, like, a video that was talking about it, trying to beat the box office, all the top comments were like, people are pissed that they called it a re-release. Because it's like, there's barely any content of value in it. It seems like a cash grab. They released like a unfinished CGI Hulk scene. Really awkward.
What, just in the movie?
Oh.
It's an after credits scene. It's something like a bunch of people like in trouble, and he saves them by lifting up a car, and then he's walking. And I saw like a phone cam footage of it, and I was like, oh, he looks worse than like the 2003 Hulk.
Wait, so is it out?
Out as in like you can go see it in cinemas, yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize.
I didn't even know that yet.
Yikes.
But what I'm currently talking about is an article where they say it doesn't make sense that Cap wouldn't tell people before he did it.
It does make sense to me that he wouldn't tell people.
He told Bucky there is a potential for concern that he might have considered, because he is Cap. Like, it's a, I think I sent you this message, right? I was like, what he's doing is essentially killing himself from their perspective, because he just leaves.
Well, yeah, he's
and he comes back immediately as super old.
It's like, well, it literally is leaving forever, which isn't, he's removing himself from their lives.
It's selfish as a move, but it's kind of like well-earned. You can't really fault him for it, necessarily.
Yeah, like, how dare you not devote the rest of your life to us as well?
Yeah. Exactly. I mean,
I don't know. I could have. It didn't have to be a big reveal. I could have gone for a scene where he explains it to him.
Yeah, but they wanted it to be a reveal. That much is obvious. They wanted it to be a shock.
Well, there's no way Screen Rant have provided enough evidence to prove that this was out of character for Cap. If I were to steelman their point, I'd be happy to say there is something to this. Clearly a lot of the motivation for it was that big reveal, because they even broke some of their own time travel rules for it. Oh, and just to be clear, as things that don't make sense go, yeah, someone acting out of character totally does qualify for something that doesn't make sense. After having thought about this for a long enough time, I've basically got nowhere beyond... I mean, I guess you can make a case for it, not arriving at any kind of definitive conclusion one way or the other, so fuck it, I'm happy to give them the sympathy point. It's not like it's going to make a huge difference to their total anyway. Number 5 is, why a snap? Let's read it, shall we? During Avengers Infinity War, Thanos used the stones at will, without any hand motions until that final snap. Wah wah. Actually, you may not have been paying attention, clearly you weren't. He closes his fist to use the stones. In fact, there's even a line about it in the movie.
Don't let him close his fist.
Did you just see that and think that Doctor Strange just had a thing against closed fists? You know, maybe he's jealous of anyone who hasn't suffered major trauma to their hands, and wants to rob them of the use of theirs too. Except, just kidding, I know he's got back the use of his hands because I actually watched these films. Until that final snap. Infamous and world-changing, it was fitting for Thanos' character. After all, this had been his plans for years. These had been his plans. Purging planets one by one. And he could finish it all with a literal snap. However, after this, the Avengers also used the snap. Sure, Tony Stark might have just snapped to taunt him, but the Thanos they're fighting didn't use the snap. He wouldn't be riled, just get dusted in confusion. They seem to be suggesting that because Thanos didn't need to use hand motions before, despite the fact that he did, that snapping is almost like an affectation, something that they're doing for show, rather than how you signify to the stones that you want to make your big world-changing thing happen. But this argument is based on the faulty premise that it doesn't take hand motions to use the stones. They then go on to say, moreover, why a snap? It might have been cooler if Thanos just closed his fist, symbolizing him closing his order around the universe, and then half of everyone's gone. It could have all made more sense. Since we don't really get any substantial background on the stones or the gauntlet or how any of it works, we don't know how it should work, and therefore we can't point to how it does work and say that it doesn't make sense. Imagine there was a movie plot where they needed to find out some random dude's password and you don't know anything about the dude whose password it is, and then you find out that the password is Flabbelnabel. Then you couldn't just say, well, that doesn't make any sense, it's Flabbelnabel, but why isn't it Zarbeldorch instead? I think it would have made more sense if it was Zarbeldorch. You're pulling that out of your ass, friends. And don't give me that crap that it makes more sense with a closing fist because of the symbolism. You can make up symbolism like that for any hand motion. It should have been a snap, because a snap is a very swift and decisive motion. It symbolizes how Thanos is swiftly and decisively enacting his will on the universe. It should have been a peace sign, because Thanos believes he's bringing peace to the universe. If everyone has all the resources they need, there'll be less conflict over those resources, and the peace sign symbolizes that. It should have been the wanker hand sign, because the upward motion of the wank symbolizes the rising population of the universe, and the downward motion of the wank symbolizes Thanos correcting that overpopulation. It's all very deep and interesting. I think this comment cements them very firmly at the score they were at before, which is 2.5 out of 25. Number 4 is another one about the time travel. Although this time they're right. It only took them 4 attempts to try and criticize how the time travel works to actually get one that holds water. But now they've finally got there. Their complaint is that the time travel doesn't quite all fit together, and it would have been nicer for their time travel to make more sense, which, yeah, is true in the vaguest possible way you can put it. Although, based on the fact that they clearly don't understand the time travel to begin with, I'm guessing they're just right by accident here. Since if they don't know the most basic things about how the time travel works, they clearly haven't put in the thought to figure out the places in which it doesn't. So they've got another point, even though it was probably a fluke. The third one is that there's less loss than expected, and yeah, it's as dumb as it sounds. They claim that we only lost Iron Man, Black Widow, Vision, and Heimdall, what's that R doing there, Screen Rant? And then make some really flimsy excuses as to why they're not counting Cap, Gamora, or Loki as losses. So yes, Screen Rant, we only lost 7 named characters. What an underwhelming saga. Fuck off. And just to be clear, I would count Gamora as a loss because we lose all of the development we've got for her over the last few years, and we basically lose the character that we know, and substitute her for an essentially different character. Even if that character is a different version of her, she is a very different person. If you don't want to count her as a loss, okay, but then we'd still have 6 losses, so... Oh, and even if there were no losses, that wouldn't be something that didn't make sense if it was done functionally within the story. Just in case you needed more reasons that they're wrong about this one. Things that don't make sense in Avengers Endgame. Number 2, Black Widow's Soulstone sacrifice. They're happy to accept that Black Widow would be willing to sacrifice herself, but say it's the circumstances that make it a bit murky. Let's read their justifications for that. When Thanos had to sacrifice Gamora, Red Skull made it clear with Thanos that the sacrifice had to be the thing that he loved most in the world. Nope. That's a lie. That's not true. No. Actually, what he said the sacrifice had to be was that which you love, a soul for a soul, and didn't get more specific than that. Is that trying to imply that Clint and Nat love each other the most? Because that doesn't make sense. You're right, that wouldn't make sense if it was in the film. Furthermore, no one really reacted or dwelled on the fact that their friend was gone. Yeah, apart from the scene where they all stop to mourn Black Widow, no one reacts at all. They then go on to talk about how it's strange that she didn't get a funeral, which is true, and I agree. And I would be giving them a half point for that if it was their entire point, but since, like, most of this point is already wrong, they don't get the half point, I'm afraid. And the final thing that apparently doesn't make sense in Avengers Endgame, we've finally got there. 1. The Young Avengers mystery. Hang on, what even is that? Well, their argument revolves around a theory that because there are loads of young characters relating to the heroes in the MCU, that they'll come together and form the Young Avengers. And this entry in their list complains that we don't get confirmation for that theory. Many fans thought with a title like Endgame, the MCU would finally confirm or deny the Young Avengers theory. However, it didn't acknowledge it at all, though it left more breadcrumbs. The universe aged up both Harley, Tony's young engineer buddy in Iron Man 3. No, the movie didn't do that. Time did that, you fucking lemons. And Cassie Lang into teenagers. Because of the snap, Shuri and Peter are still teenagers. Hey guys, the presence of teenage characters aren't breadcrumbs. Young people often exist anyway. And on top of that, I feel it goes without saying that the fact that a movie didn't confirm a fan theory isn't something that doesn't make sense in that movie. So we've got our total. Their total score is 3.5 out of 25. And it's actually a little bit less impressive than that, because let me just remind you how they got those points. Because when you remember that, it's even worse. They got a half point for recognizing that Thor's art could have been handled better, a half point for recognizing the contrivance of all the original Avengers not being dusted, and a half point for noticing that Hulk's art could have been handled a lot better. The reason, of course, that these were only half points is because they're not things that don't make sense. They're writing issues, but they're not logic flaws, which, as they clearly stated in their introduction, is the thing that they were planning on talking about. I gave them 1 whole point out of sympathy because I couldn't decide whether they were right or not, so just decided to give them the point anyway. But you know, there are many good cases for this not being a point, and the other point I gave them was for when they said the time travel could have made more sense. But they didn't go into any specifics of how it could have made more sense and where it didn't make sense. I gave them a point because technically what they said is true, but based on the fact that they repeatedly demonstrated they had no idea what they were talking about in terms of the time travel, I think it's fairly safe to say they didn't know what they were talking about here either, and just happened to be right because they were vague enough to not say anything specific that was objectively wrong. I gave them 3.5 out of 25 for this, but if we tighten up the criteria to say, to get any points they have to point out a logical flaw in Avengers Endgame that's clear-cut and not at all murky, because they know what they're talking about, their grand total is 0 out of 25. I don't exaggerate when I say this is probably one of the worst things I've ever covered, if not the worst. Someone was paid to write this nonsense. Endgame is a movie with plenty of holes, this should not have been hard, but somehow the writers at Screen Rant still managed to write an article this shit. So, conclusions. Screen Rant, I have got one recommendation for you, right? And it's a film recommendation. It's called Avengers Endgame. I think you might really enjoy it if you watched it. But that's it! This video has turned out way longer than I expected it to, which I guess is a good thing. You get more of my wonderful content to enjoy. But other than that, I have nothing left to say to you except a goodbye.